Welcome to Surviving Society. Welcome to the first episode of Surviving Society presents the Maslaha podcast. We are so excited today to be in conversation with Raheel, Sabia and Suleiman for our first episode. We're going to talk a bit about their trajectories, their journeys, but also the overall objectives of Maslaha and what the vision for change is and who are the groups that Maslaha advocate for. So excited to be in conversation with you all. Such a big fan of the organisation and really excited to also share with listeners in a kind of in-depth way over the coming weeks, like the types of work that you do and the types of change that we're looking to see, particularly for Muslim populations. So thank you so much for coming in.
It's so good to be here. It's really exciting.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
I'm going to start off. Sabia, how you doing? You're looking at it.
I'm all right.
You're okay? Okay.
Yeah.
Sabia, how do you come to be here today? Tell us a bit about your journey into this work.
I've only joined Maslaha about a year and a half ago. Before that, I'd been working for about 10 years in international development, in peace building and conflict resolution, and was getting pretty disillusioned with it. Yeah, cynical about the kind of international development sphere, the kind of conversations that are happening, very neo-colonial in a way, quite paternalistic in the ways in which we were talking about how we treat and engage with like other contexts and communities. And I think I was really being driven by thinking about like, how do I recenter or refocus towards thinking about my own community? So I grew up in the north of Ireland, in Belfast, really small Muslim community. Like we all knew each other. It was really small, like brown and black community essentially as well. You'd go into a supermarket anywhere in the north and if you saw somebody who wasn't white, you knew them, or your parents did. And so I had a really strong sense of kind of community and kind of mutual support and solidarity among that community. Like as my family were kind of the first migrants, one of the first families of migrants of Muslims to the north, and so created a really strong sense of who we were, how we helped each other from whatever backgrounds, and people were coming from Kosovo, from Palestine, from South Asia, and all these histories and trajectories of also my family were torn apart by partition as well. So all these histories and trajectories of like violence and conflict and bringing that with them. So I wanted to kind of recenter, I guess, in my work towards thinking about my own community. And I'd heard about Maslaha for a long time. I've been following their work for a long time and been to lots of their events and knew people who'd worked for them. In the work that I was doing, I'd been thinking a lot around safety and security of communities. And in the work that I was doing, in international development, we talked about safety and security, but it didn't feel like it was a way that reinforced individual or community sense of security. It was often state security, or if it was often in a more ways in which didn't interrogate the ways in which formal security kind of actually threatens communities. The work that Maslaha was directed me that way.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Sabia. Amazing. Suleiman? Hello. Tell us about how you come to be here today.
How I come to be here today? I just want to start by saying I'm actually from Leicester and I'm not from London.
Big up Midlands.
And the reason why I think that plays a big part in why I come to be here. So growing up in Leicester, I grew up in a very diverse community. I grew up in an area called Highfields in Leicester. Coincidentally, very similar. What reminds me of Leicester, my area specifically, is when I walk around some areas in London and I see council estates or flats just jam-packed as much as they can into one area. It's quite similar to where I grew up in Highfields. It's a sprawling council estate. We have like 4 high-rise buildings and we have a lot of flats jumbled into one area. So I grew up in Highfields in Leicester, like a lot of people around my time. So a lot of the black and brown people that I grew up with, education was very passive. We went to school for the sake of just going to school. Education never really spoke to us or related to us in any way. A lot of years skiving school, and just as we got older and became teenagers, the messing about probably got a bit worse. And it ended up me having a prison sentence for 2 years. After being released from prison, and this was in 2010. Sat down and I thought, okay, where do I go next from here onwards? At that time, just come out of prison, I didn't have any idea about sort of this big world of like making change in the prison system. I was just back into the same area, same environment, same friends who are still my friends to this day. And I could just see like people a lot older than me sort of going in and out of prison. There wasn't really sort of anyone breaking out of that vicious sort of cycle that we ended up in. So I decided, let me study. That was just the sake of studying. I didn't know what I wanted to study. Like I guess a lot of people that probably go into university, like not knowing what you want to do until you get there. So yeah, I managed to get enough grades to apply for university, and then not having any idea, like looking at prospectuses and thinking there's so many different courses, like what do I even do? People from my area don't go to uni. It's not a common thing. I don't have many friends that have gone to university. Everyone tends to go into work if they do go into anything, just because of the level of poverty, the sort of area that we're from. Income is your number one priority, and bringing money into your household is probably the most important thing. But then I remember I went to like a taster day at University of Leicester, where it's like people would come in that are planning to go university. I was probably a bit older than the rest because I was sort of 21. I'd taken a couple of years out because obviously I was in prison. And so I was with a lot of 18-year-olds going into this university and just looking at like what a university actually looks like. I've never been into in that sort of environment whatsoever. Went there and I remember there was a lecture, like a taster lecture on criminology. And when the lecturer was speaking, I was like, oh, that talks to me, that does. I wouldn't say it out loud, but I was like in my head, I've just come out of prison. Everything he's talking about is something that I can relate to. So I was like, let me go study criminology. And that was literally where the coin dropped, in the sense that that's what I know I want to study now. Applied to study criminology. Thankfully was offered a space at Birmingham University. Went there.
Whoop, whoop.
I studied there. For the first year, I didn't mention it to anybody because I was like, oh, I can't tell these guys. They just come out of jail. They're going to think, oh, we can't be friends with him, or like we stay really. But one of my friends really jokes a lot about it. So I met him at university, and he says, when my parents sent me to university, they'd think, oh, you'd go on to meet like doctors and lawyers and engineers. But I met somebody that's come out of prison, and we always just joke around about it. It's one of our pieces of banter. But yeah, I went to Birmingham, studied criminology. I heard of an organisation in my second year that did a lot of work around sort of penal reform and making change in the criminal justice system, who I got involved with at the time. And it just introduced me to like, yeah, this world of using your experiences to better the lives of other people that are going through the same sort of things. In terms of sort of Maslaha and the work at Maslaha, I think after a few years of doing the work I was doing, I was introduced to the work at Maslaha. And that really spoke to me as a person and myself, of being that young brown Muslim boy in prison. And I felt like the work that they were doing was for myself in a way. And I wanted to sort of work with them as much as I can to make that change that was needed for a lot of people in my position that I was in when I was a young 18-year-old. So, and then that's how I got introduced to Maslaha and their work. And then since then, it's just our relationships got stronger, and now I'm actually a full-time member of staff at Maslaha. And it's been great. And I feel like the work that I am doing is really credible, and it really speaks to my community that I'm from.
Incredible. Thank you. So, honestly, this episode, I'm just going to be blown away, I think. I'm just going to be blown away the whole series. Like, this organisation is just full of such incredible people. Now, Raheel, tell us how you come to be here.
My mum and dad met. No.
No, what? No, you don't. Any listeners to the show, no. That's where I like starting from there. Start from there.
Harry White was playing. No. It's really actually powerful hearing how Zabir and Suleiman also got here, to be honest with you. Yeah, and yeah, it's amazing to work with them. So I set up Maslaha. Like, it's been over 10 years now. We've been a charity.
Bashment horns, please, George. Thank you.
It was never a plan, but I think at the time I was doing a number of different things, and this was after 9/11, the bombings in London, and we were just in an environment where there was such a kind of violence and toxicity towards Muslim communities, both on a kind of day-to-day level, but also just more widely from government. And you kind of look around to sort of like think, okay, who's doing stuff? And it was just really difficult to sort of see people who I felt were just talking sense on the media. Like, you'd sort of like turn the TV on and you'd have like some MP and you'd be like, what are you saying? Like, why are you representing our kind of communities? Yeah, so I kind of out of that, and I'd kind of also gone through this phase of like, I was a journalist, but then I was helping other people set up organisations. And the work really started from there, really, just around like looking at the kind of very practical needs that that Muslim communities were facing. Maslaha means for the common good in the public interest, and it's kind of rooted in the idea, the Quranic idea of finding creative solutions to society's problems when those solutions aren't so visible. Like, and it requires you to engage intellectually, creatively, emotionally, spiritually, but also with others in community as well. And our first work was kind of around health and the kind of, the model of how you work in community, recognising the knowledge and expertise that exists there in a kind of really, really local space, but then how you kind of affect wider change through that kind of quite local work, the really granular work. And I think over the years, one of the things that's kind of become really obvious is this thing of being able to kind of see both the granular and the kind of macro in the same space together and hold those two things together and see how they're both like deeply connected.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Raheel. What a privilege it is to just be in this space with you all. And what I love about Maslaha, any other groups and people that are dedicated to this work, is our kind of stories of how we come to be, and like how those stories are so often informed by racialised and class marginalisation, but also the light side of community, of love, of coming together. Like it's like a fusion of those two things. And I think that that's what all three of you kind of just introduced to us. So thank you so much. I guess it'd be good for the listeners to just talk a bit about, in practice, what does Maslaha do for the Muslim community?
We work in education, health, gender rights, and there's the prison work as well.
So Maslaha work in education, health, gender rights,
the arts, the prison system.
And the prison system.
With the work that we've been doing has changed over time as well in terms of the sort of prison work. Initially, a lot of our work was supporting sort of bigger organisations, bigger charities that do a lot of work in a lot of prisons around the country, but don't do it well when it comes to Muslim communities or just any diverse community within the prison estate. So we started working with sort of larger charities, helping them, making their sort of work more culturally relevant, more accessible for people from the communities that we represent. I think since then, things have actually developed in where we've been recognising sort of gaps within these failing systems that we can address. So when it comes to looking at mental health in the criminal justice system, what are we doing as an organisation to improve that for the people from our communities, as well as working with these larger organisations? What services are we putting together that speaks to these communities and actually supports these communities massively compared to a lot of the mainstream support that is available? As well as that, we've been looking at just the stories from these communities that exist, which are usually forgotten. A lot of the times I would read prison reports around Muslim communities, ethnic minority communities in prison, and all it would just say is they report a more negative experience, full stop. There's not really much more on there. And what does that negative experience look like? What's it actually look like in person? And I think what we've been doing is to help give a platform to these stories. Or this is what these negative experiences look like. Like a Muslim person might go down with their plate at dinner time in a prison, and the person working in the canteen will put something that's not halal. So say they've put pork on their plate, and they will think it's okay to just remove it and then just put what they were supposed to put on that plate, not knowing that sometimes that's done in a way to discriminate against the Muslim people. So there's so many little stories. Well, I wouldn't even say little. I think there's so many examples of discrimination that happen within the system that don't really make it out of prison. We don't ever hear about it. These reports never have these stories. So I think it's important for us as an organisation to give these stories a platform and give the people a platform to make sure that these things are heard out in the public. And that's the only way we make a meaningful change, by making sure people know about what's actually going on the inside, because we don't hear it from anything mainstream whatsoever.
A lot of what we do is kind of working in solidarity with Muslims in prison. When I say that, I mean creating space or building space for Muslims in prison to kind of live and be seen the way they want to be seen in many ways. So without the kind of labels and stereotypes that are put on them by society, and the ways in which surveillance can create senses of insecurity for them, and they're seen as kind of risky groups in some way. So for just to give an example, like Muslims in prison, the way in which they practice their faith, the way in which they may pray, read the Quran, that's often seen as a risk within prison. But for them, it's something that's kind of a source of comfort. It's a way to create community for them. A lot of what we do is providing that kind of space for those kind of stories or those experiences to be acknowledged and recognised for what they are, for how they identify them, and kind of challenging then also, I guess, challenging the stereotypes and oppressions that limit the possibilities for Muslims to live and thrive as they want to. So one thing, for example, that we've just created a service recently, which is a counselling service for Muslims who've come out of the prison system and out of incarceration, for them and families whose loved ones have been incarcerated, and that's providing counselling support by Muslim therapists for Muslim. So recognising that often within the prison system, issues around mental health well-being are either dismissed completely, or if they are there, they don't acknowledge the role of faith in providing comfort and support. Yeah, this is one way to actually acknowledge that as well.
Amazing, thank you. And Rahil, could you talk to us a little bit about what the services Maslaha, you've mentioned about mental health support, but what other services Maslaha sort of focus on, both facilitating and instigating as an organisation?
So I think, just kind of building on what Suleiman and Zabia said, I mean, if we were just from an academic perspective, there'd be people who talk about research, right? But I think for us, it's almost like bearing witness, which is has a completely different tone and emphasis on what we're actually doing, people who are being harmed in the prison system. There's this really lovely essay by Hanif Abdul-Rakib, who's a writer, poet, and he talks about, there's this concert that Aretha Franklin put on, and the audience is in communion with Aretha Franklin. It's not like the audience isn't, and it's a black audience as well. It's not an audience that's just sitting back and kind of watching, but it's kind of engaged in almost a kind of quite spiritual event. And I think for us, when we go into the prison system or when we're talking to people who've been released from prison, it's the bearing witness is being in, like Zabia said, it's being in solidarity with those people, but then also understanding that everything we do almost has different phases. So there's an immediate harm that needs to be met. So we will work with kind of really large charities, like Suleiman was saying, and improve, say, the mental health service they provide, or improve the way that they prepare people to leave prison and connect with their families. That's not our kind of wider goal. Is we shouldn't have prisons.
Yeah.
And what does liberation look like for our communities? And so, kind of coming home is an example of how do we build community infrastructure that begins with a counselling service, but is looking forward to how we mobilise other parts of our community. So, it's weird. It's service doesn't almost do justice to kind of what the work is. It's kind of, because the service could be training, it could be building resources that somebody could use in a prison system. But all of those things are also caught up with a sense of we need to find different ways of creating knowledge and almost becoming a self-determined community of people. And what does that look like when you have this massive structure, this system of kind of the prison system that isn't just, it's Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about, isn't just on the margins of society. It's kind of tentacles run through so many other parts of our lives as well. Maybe that sounds quite, it sounds massively ambitious, but actually when we started this work, nobody was talking about Muslims in the prison system, really. It's 18% of the prison population. The most important rights of being able to worship are denied regularly. And so then, thinking through like, well, why is that allowed to happen? Well, that also means that some of the charities that work in the criminal legal system are complicit through their silence.
Yeah.
And through their kind of research, in quotes, that they produce. So then how do we counter that? What's the kind of counterinsurgency to that work as well?
Yeah, no, it's really powerful. And I'm just thinking about when we've had you on the show before, Raheel, and with Shireen Fernandez, and we were talking about 2001 to now, and like that the mass imprisonment of Muslims from 9/11 to now, like who actually cared about that? What did that actually look like in practice? Who was supporting these people? Who was advocating for these people? Who was advocating for people whilst there was state-led Islamophobia on a global scale? Like, it's like when you deep it, you're like, wow, the status of citizenship has multiple layers and hierarchies. And if you look at the Muslim community, that is a clear, in prison, that is a clear demonstration of that.
I've heard Alana Lenton, I think, on your show talk about like global Islamophobia.
Yeah.
The prison system. And even, there's I'm only quoting him now because he's so the Independent Review of Counterterrorism Legislation has called terrorism in prison of international concern. So he's, so people are thinking of prisons in a kind of international way. So we kind of have to also think of what that means in how strategies are shared between countries to control certain populations. And also, the data shows this, that if going to prison is also leads to premature death. As Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about, state-sanctioned premature death.
Mm.
And I think it's important to be quite explicit in those terms, right? Like, I think that's the thing that Suleiman was saying. It's kind of in the kind of standard frameworks of like reports, that kind of explicit phrasing of what happens in the prison system is kind of missing. That violence is missing.
I think it's also like, it's interesting if you look at like the reasons why prisons were set up in the first place and the function that they had within society as a way essentially to punish and remove those who were seen to be like undesirable from society. And they were often the ones that were poor, working class. Also like those that are marginalised from like education spaces, from housing, from, making livelihoods. And I think that's very true today as well in the ways in which prisons functions. I've been writing a piece around Palestinian prisoners and hunger strikers. It was really interesting reading about how Palestinians outside of the prison viewed those within prisons who had been administratively detained illegally by the Israeli occupation. They viewed prisoners as integral to the liberation movement. They were also almost seen as like the moral compass of the struggle. And often, whenever there was a lot of division outside within the Palestinian street, it was the prisoners that kind of called for unity and called a kind of a clarity of like what the issues were and where the movement needed to move to. And I think that says a lot about the ways in which like conditions in prison also reflect kind of broader society as well, and we often miss that. And so a lot of what we've been doing as well is thinking about how do we get our communities to mobilise around kind of in solidarity with Muslims in prison and recognising that like the struggle for liberation within prisons is the same as for liberation for all our communities inside and out.
It's important to recognise that the Muslim population within prison has actually doubled in the last decade. No other group within sort of prisons has actually increased that fold as compared to the Muslim population. I guess it speaks to that sort of post-2001, the political sort of Islamophobic way things are.
I think it's really important that we repeat this over and over again because the global movement towards Islamophobia on both an interpersonal, structural and state-led basis is huge. It has been, there's nothing like it in my lifetime. Like Islamophobia has been such a key tenet of culture, state policy, both here in Britain and globally. Like We can talk about other groups, we can talk about that. But actually, if we're talking about Islamophobia, like, there's not much really that touches this in the same way. And you look at 2001 to now, and it's astounding how few are bearing witness in the way that you guys are.
I think it's important for communities to actually recognise that as well.
Yeah.
People from the sort of community that it's affecting. I feel like such a huge number of Muslims in prison, and I went to a school that was probably 80 to 90% Muslim, and we had police in our school, and that was accepted as a completely normal thing to have a police officer stationed at your school, which led to more interaction with the police, people being stopped and searched more, young Muslim boys having to deal with police more often. And then when sometimes we would speak to sort of people in the community, parents would feel like, oh, maybe it's a good thing to have that police in the school because it's protecting my child, but they don't realise the harm that's actually causing, which plays a big part in terms of the number of Muslim people in prison, how we're policed, and sort of these government agendas of prevent just policing our communities more than any other community, which automatically will lead to more people being within the criminal justice system. I think what's really important about our work as well at Maslaha is us guys all being from them communities and understanding how them communities work and what works in them communities. I think it plays a big part in the service that we've introduced, where it's counselling for Muslims affected by the prison system and their families, only delivered by Muslim therapists. Because in my community, when there's an issue between families, young boys might have a fight with another one, we don't go to the police, we don't go to outside authorities. Our parents will either go to the imam in the mosque and have a conversation, or we'll go to that person's parents and have a conversation, and things will be dealt with in a way that works with the community because of that lack of trust, which is ingrained for a very long time. In the sense that we don't trust anybody coming on from the outside of our community trying to tell us how to do things. And I think it's really important that us being from the community understand that, and that sort of is ingrained in the services that we deliver as well.
It's the kind of repercussions and consequences of what else is happening in the world. So I remember there was a really senior civil servant giving evidence to the Public Accounts Committee, like during COVID. They had managed to get more money to build prisons. So they're spending £4 billion now building more prisons over the next 20 years. And I imagine it's because the economy was suffering. So building work is a way to get the economy, and that's all around COVID. But we know when you recruit more police, when you build more prisons, that it's Black, brown, Muslim communities who are going to end up disproportionately in those spaces. There's those things that are also kind of happening at the same time. We're doing a piece around parva spray as well. Parva spray is like a pepper spray that prison officers can use in prison. It's kind of been rolled out quite extensively since COVID. And what was really interesting, we were, and it's been disproportionately targeting Muslim and Black people. And this information isn't widely available. We got it through Freedom of Information requests. But it's interesting hearing the then Justice Secretary, Robert Buckland, talk about how he was lobbied quite heavily by prison officer unions.
Interesting.
During COVID. But so people were locked up in their cells for 23 hours. The Prison Officers Union is lobbying him regularly, and he uses the word regularly, which implies they have access to people at the highest level in government in a way that other civil society people don't. And he basically, and so Parva was rolled out extensively. And there's a kind of, when he's giving evidence, there's a sort of, somebody raises the fact that, they use the term BAME are sort of disproportionately more likely to face violence in prison. And it's almost like the way he responds to that is oh, of course that matters, and we need to make sure that that's reduced. But it's almost said as an aside. And I think part of the work is also seeing these other kinds of actions and things that are happening globally that worsen that Islamophobia, right? They all kind of, I guess that's what Stuart Hall calls that conjectural analysis, right? It's all of these different threads that are influencing each other and reinforcing each other as well. And And I guess it matters in the way that we hear and read those as well. And then I think also make that information really publicly available as a kind of which is what you do. You know, kind of make that. I think it has to be a kind of public learning space as well. Like, you know, we don't suddenly end up in prison. It's by design. And if we don't know that, then how can we respond to that as well?
No, I was just thinking about like how hard we have to work to like make that argument or to challenge these narratives. Like you're saying about Robert Buckland, the like official statements, like the Terrorism in Prison report, like the Prevent report, they just have to put out like language around Muslims being a risk, around the idea that prison staff should have more powers to deal with, you know, extremism in prison. I think it's in the Terrorism in Prison report, they refer to Muslims as like, you know, Muslim gangs, all this language that's so evocative and creates a story about what Muslims look like in prison. And then that gets reinforced through policy, through legislation that give extra powers to, you know, prison staff. And we just have to work so hard to like undo that. And when we try, you know, we're just so easily dismissed. And like, where's the evidence? Well, you know, the evidence that they provide is so weak and is based on a lot of conjecture and a lot of assumptions and stereotypes, you know, just feeding off that Islamophobia. It's almost like it doesn't need to be justified because Islamophobia is so just prevalent and so accepted as a narrative.
I'm interested in that point that Raheel brings up about Robert Buckland. I feel like it comes out in a lot of politician reports where it's that we know what happens, but we don't give a shit attitude. And it's interesting, the similar sort of thing is in the Jonathan Hall report about terrorism in prison, where it talks about this report concentrates on Muslim people within prison and the risks around that. And then it talks about there is an issue. It's not exactly quoted as this, but there is an issue that normal Muslim people will feel targeted because of this, just by the fact that they want to come together as a community. But the prison service needs to do as hard as they can to try. The prison service needs to do more to avoid this. That's all it says. So it says that regular Muslim people are going to be at the front line of this and they're going to feel singled out, but we need to try to avoid that. And that's all it says. And I feel like it's quite similar to what Robert Buckland says, that, yeah, we know it happens, but we don't really care.
I think it's even more blatant than that. In that report, you know, they say like, it shouldn't be a barrier. The idea that like Muslims might feel targeted shouldn't be a barrier to like putting them into separation centres or putting them into segregation or to enacting policies to prevent risk. The idea of the risk is much greater than individual human rights or safety of people. Like it's even more blatant, I think, in the report.
Raheel, Sabia Sleeman, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. Learned so much, as always. A lot of food for thought, and also just, I'm going to name it, like what's coming up for me is just anger as well. Like it is anger, like at how the mistreatment, the dehumanisation, the Islamophobia, and yeah, it's an absolute privilege to be in the studio with you guys that are doing such important advocacy and social justice work, and really looking forward to learning more about your work in the coming weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Surviving Society.
To support our work, you can rate,
review and subscribe to host or produce a series of Surviving Society.
Get in touch with us via Twitter or Instagram.